Hi, I'm Rachel with Data Curation Experts, and in this video, we are here to talk about working with open source software. I have Norm and Mark from my product team here to talk about this with me. Mark, DCE has been working in open source software since we opened our doors in about 2012. Can you tell me a little bit about why people choose open source solutions?
So, I was thinking about that question a little bit ahead of time. And really, a lot of DCE's leaning with open source comes from my own personal experience. Before I worked for DCE, I spent a number of years working in corporate IT and corporate software development and worked with a lot of proprietary systems. And in that world, there was a lack of visibility and a lack of transparency that made planning difficult, that made problem resolution difficult, that just sort of made you feel not empowered because you were sort of at the mercy of this thing that was a black box. For me, having moved to the open source world, it's a really different vibe. And in fairness, I suspect that more of the corporate world looks like this these days, having been here for a while. But one of the things is that with open source, when there's a problem, I'm now working with these amazing communities of people across multiple different institutions with multiple different perspectives and talents who are all working to solve the same problem rather than having my problem issue go into some anonymous ticketing system and hoping that I will see a release at some point in the future. So there were a lot of people when I was starting to do open source who criticized open source for it's full of bugs and there's all these problems and everything. My experience is that's also true of closed source, of proprietary software. It's just that we don't know it as much. So for me, that transparency and that collaboration that happens in open source is really one of the key drivers for working in this kind of world than a proprietary world.
We build digital repositories for university libraries and cultural heritage institutions. And so we build on open source software. Can you tell me a little bit about the open source technologies that we use?
Yeah, so DCE sort of started life in what was then the Hydra world and is now the Samvera world. And that world really grew out of a bunch of institutions that were sharing similar problems of having built bespoke front ends on top of Fedora repositories, and then lost funding, had other initiatives come up that took away their development resources, had developers who got hired away to more lucrative private endeavors. And so there were all these institutions who had repositories that they liked using a backend that they liked, Fedora, that couldn't sustain the front end. And so they all came together and said, we're all facing similar problems and shouldn't we be able to leverage a common solution? And in looking at it, they realized that a lot of them also used Blacklight as a front-end discovery tool for patron discovery in various places. So really the Samvera community grew out of that commonality of Blacklight. So that means that we use Blacklight as our discovery interface, which means we program in Ruby and we run on the Ruby on Rails stack. On the back end, we have Fedora as sort of the persistent store and the source of authority for things that go in the repository. And then in between, we use Solr to provide a rich search and faceting and browsing experience. And more recently, we've added things like IIIF and Universal Viewer to give us this really it's been super cool to watch sort of the technology transformation as we've been able to give Universal Viewer to give you rich, deep pan and zoom and pagination and all the kinds of digitized content that exist.
And what about DCE's role in that community?
So, we sort of grew up with the community and were involved in lots of the building and DCE resources. If you look at the commit histories in a lot of the repos, we're there doing a lot of the work. A lot of our individual institutional projects fed into work that has gone into those shared repos and common projects. And so over that period of time, one of the things that I think is really unique about DCE and the few other vendors in the space, as opposed to working for an institution, is we've had the opportunity over that decade to see how a number of different institutions solve similar and related problems, and sort of to triangulate from that, which is a harder thing to do if you're an institutional developer and all of your world is sort of your world's your institution's problems. So we get to see and we get to sort of plagiarize best practices from across the community, which is really nice.
Mark, why do you think the institutions choose to go with open source, and particularly the Samvera?
So I think open source in general is a really good mission alignment with most of our, most of the institutions we work with are in the cultural heritage or knowledge sharing world. So university libraries, repositories, archives, are all about collecting and curating and keeping, but making available content to their patrons, to scholars, to the general public, for all kinds of use cases. And so that openness of the content fits really well with the openness of the software. And again, this sort of multi-institutional, multidisciplinary perspective that I was talking about. And I think then at a deeper level, some of the ways that the Samvera community in particular works and the ways that it comes together to think about how to move software forward, again, map well to those higher level institutional and really sort of disciplinary goals of the folks that we get to work with.
And Norm, thinking about design, are there some open source tools that you like to use, and what makes them compelling?
It's mostly about just building things, and so a lot of the things you're building with are the assets, right? Icons and imagery. In both those cases, particularly we use Font Awesome to. They just have a big library that the community has built and shared with the world. To place, it just makes things easier. You don't have to think too hard about it. They already have something built. I don't have to build something from scratch. I can use the resources that are available in the community. Another place that we use a lot is in images for mocking up things. We use unsplash.com. They have a great resources for us and really great imagery that people decide to share with the community. So you'll actually see those if you use Tenejo. That's one of the hero shots we use. We have 3 shots in there that kind of rotate on each refresh. As far as framework goes, we use Bootstrap 3 currently, and we're working our way up to Bootstrap 5 along with the Blacklight community there. The framework just allows us to just not have to work so hard about building some structure around. We just don't have to think too hard about building the structure. That's the nice part about it. I also use VS Code. I know that's owned by Microsoft, but it is the MIT license. So that is another tool that I use. So.
Right.
There are graphic editors tools out there. I personally don't use them, but there are. I just want to mention Inkscape and GIMP, which is a vector and a raster graphics editors.
When an institution is looking for an open source solution, what is a way for them to, how do they know that the software is solid and stable?
So, when we're looking at whether to adopt open source software or to include open source components in our work, there's a few sort of key criteria that we look at to sort of vet the applications and the components and the libraries that we might be using. One is sort of what's the commit history or the project length of the project. So, one of the things is because we work in this domain that's about really long-lived content, we know that technology is going to change repeatedly underneath the content that we're trying to present and manage. And so there's lots of new technical shininess that come out every year, every month, every day. And a lot of it's great, but it's hard at the beginning to know how long it's going to live. And we have this content that we know we want to last a long time. So we tend to be a little more conservative and look at projects that have a long track record. And that in addition to having a long track record, have an active track record. So, if you see a project that has a lot of activity and then tapers off to nothing, that means one of two things. Either it's solved the problem perfectly and it's super stable. And there are examples of software like that we use, or it meant that there was a lot of hype and energy around it, but it's kind of petered out. So we often look for what's the level of activity of the community around the software that we're adopting. And then sort of related to that, also sort of what's the commit or the community, the number of contributors involved, because we don't want to be building on things that sort of have one person behind them. Because if we lose that, then either we need to develop the expertise and bring that in-house, or that project is sort of dead in the water. So we like to see projects that have, again, a diversity of contributors. Then on top of all of that, then is maybe the frequency of releases in that project. So if we see sort of a regular release schedule, that tells us something sort of about the professionalism behind the project, and what's going on with it, as opposed to something that may have very chaotic release schedules. That gives you another hint about the project. So those are some of the criteria we look at. And then also just fit for function, is it something that solves a need that we have?
Right.
So what compelled DCE to create a hosted solution on top of the open source technology?
So the Samvera community was really envisioned as a repository framework. So a kit of parts, so Legos. And that's great if you have the skill and the resources and the time to put together your Lego masterpiece. But there's a lot of smaller institutions that really want some of the benefits, and again, that have that mission alignment of, we'd really like to be using open source to support this content that we're trying to make available to the world, that don't have maybe the runway to do the steep learning curve that you would need to get servers set up and deployment scripting and configuration management and all of the dependencies that Hyrax or Samvera stack needs. So we need to run fits to characterize file information toolset to characterize the files as they come in. We use a gem called Hydra Derivatives that uses FFmpeg and ImageMagick and a few other server tools that get installed to create all the derivatives. When you load a file, can I make a friendly version of this to view online? There's all of those things completely apart from the application itself, and then you still need to install and customize the application to have the data model you want and things like that. All of that can be a steep learning curve for a small institution. We ran into a lot of institutions that wanted to do this, but just couldn't either afford the cost to have us customize for them all the level that they needed, or to do the training and do the onboarding that they would need to do to build a team. So we were trying to sort of fit a middle ground of, is there a general purpose sort of common set of requirements? And having worked in this community for 10 years and had lots of successful projects and lots of folks who we had to say, no, there's not a good solution for you fast enough, we can kind of take all of that information and say, well, how could we make something that got folks most of the way there so that we get them up and running quickly? And then they could have a longer runway to build their personal team if they wanted to build a team in-house, because they could start working on just the application and we could handle a lot of the server and systems things. Or for folks who just kind of wanted a turnkey system and really wanted to just focus on their content, they still have a lot of the benefits of open source. There's no vendor lock-in. If we were to disappear or folks decided that we weren't providing good service, right, we can just hand off their instance to them, and that's part of the design of Tenejo, is to make it very portable. And they could take that and they're not locked into some proprietary format or to some long-term contract or other things that makes it very hard for them to move off of that platform. So one of our goals in Tenejo is not only to make it an easy platform to move on to, but also to move off of, because there may be, there can in the future be reasonable reasons to move off. And even if there's not, that part of the design, I think, makes the system more robust. Like, it even makes it easier for us to think about how to do migrations and upgrades and other pieces.
That is all the time we have today. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for letting us.
Yeah, thanks for setting up the time to do this and to sort of talk at this little higher level than sometimes we get into all the nuts and bolts. So This is great.
Great. And thank you for watching. We'd be really happy to hear from you. Did you like this video? Are there any other videos you'd like to see from us? Please comment below. Thanks.